Summer nights in the Barrio had their own gravity. The heat that made daytime unbearable would finally break around 7 p.m., replaced by a coolness that didn't come from temperature dropping so much as from the sun's oppression ending. People would emerge from houses like survivors from shelters, drawn outside by the promise of breathable air and the unspoken agreement that summer evenings were communal property, that they belonged to everyone and to no one, that they were meant to be shared. The porch lights would come on one by one, yellowish bulbs that attracted moths and mosquitoes and children in equal measure. Some porches had those bug zappers that made their electric snap-crackle sound all night long, creating a rhythm that became part of the evening soundtrack. Others had citronella candles that didn't really work but smelled like trying, like caring, like the effort mattered even if the mosquitoes didn't agree. And on those nights, the best nights, the ones that lived in memory with golden edges and soft focus, someone's tia would bring out the Lotería cards. The announcement would spread without phones, without planning, through that mysterious communication network that existed in tight-knit neighborhoods. Lotería at Rosa's tonight. The words would pass from porch to porch, from mother to daughter, from neighbor to cousin, until everyone who needed to know did know, until the evening had its purpose, until the night promised something more than just sitting around trying to catch a breeze. They'd start gathering around 8, after dinner had been eaten and dishes washed, after the youngest children had been bathed and put in pajamas they'd inevitably sweat through, after the men had finished their cerveza and their talk of work and their complaints about everything from the Dodgers to the city council. The women would come carrying folding chairs and Tupperware containers of snacks nobody asked for but everyone expected. Chicharrones still warm from being fried an hour ago, cucumbers and jicama cut into sticks and doused with lime and chili, mangoes that would stain your fingers and your shirt but were worth it. Tia Rosa's porch was the biggest, which is why it usually hosted. Not fancy, none of the porches in the neighborhood were fancy, but it had space for 3 or 4 card tables if you squeezed, had an outlet for the electric fan that did more to move hot air around than cool anything but felt necessary anyway, had a roof that blocked the streetlight enough to create atmosphere without making it too dark to see the cards. She'd set up with the ceremony of someone preparing for church. The card tables, metal framed with vinyl tops, the kind that folded up but never quite fit back in their boxes, would be arranged in a semicircle. Folding chairs would be distributed, the good ones with padding going to the oldest TIAs because respect mattered, the wobbly ones going to whoever arrived last because that's what you got for being late. The Lotería set would be placed in the center of the main table like a holy relic, which in a way it was. The box was ancient. Cardboard softened by decades of handling, corners reinforced with tape that had yellowed and tape that was new layered over tape that was old, creating an archaeology of repairs. The images on the box had faded, you could barely make out La Sirena and El Catron anymore, but nobody needed the box to know what was inside. They knew. Their mothers had known. Their grandmothers in Mexico had known. This wasn't just a game. This was culture in cardboard form, tradition you could shuffle and deal. Inside were the cards. 54 of them, each one a piece of Mexican iconography rendered in that particular style, bright colors, bold lines, images that were somehow both childlike and sophisticated, silly and sacred. La Dama in her elegant dress. El Borracho with his bottle. La Luna with her profile. El Corazon pierced by an arrow. El Nopal, El Venado, La Muerte. Each card carried meaning beyond its image, carried jokes and sayings and cultural references that only made sense if you'd grown up with them, if you'd learned their double meanings and innuendos before you were old enough to fully understand. And the tablas, the game boards, larger cards printed with a grid of 16 random images from the deck. Each tabla was different, which meant luck was involved, but so was strategy, so was paying attention, so was staying alert even when your tia was telling the story about your cousin's no-good boyfriend for the 15th time. Tia Rosa would take her position as the caller, the cantor, the one who controlled the game's pace and provided its entertainment. She'd shuffle the deck of image cards with hands that had done this thousands of times, her rings clicking against each other, her bracelets jangling like music. The sound of those cards being shuffled was the sound of the game beginning, was the bell that called everyone to attention, was the signal that gossip time was starting under the guise of game night. "Listas?" she'd ask, and everyone would nod even though they weren't quite ready, even though someone was still getting their beans organized, even though the children were still negotiating which tabla they wanted. The beans were crucial. Dried pinto beans from someone's kitchen, kept in an old salsa jar for exactly this purpose. They served as markers, as counters, as the physical proof of progress toward winning. Each player would get a handful, 20 maybe 30, and would arrange them within easy reach, ready to be deployed when their images were called. The children would push their way into the circle of light, tablas clutched in small hands, eyes wide with the importance of being included in adult activity. They'd sit on the ground or lean against their mother's legs or claim corners of tables, their game boards spread before them like treasure maps. The older kids, the ones who thought they were too cool for family games, would hang back initially, would pretend disinterest while actually watching, would slowly drift closer until they were playing too, until they'd abandoned the performance of teenage indifference in favor of actual engagement. El Catron. Tia Rosa would call out, pulling the first card and holding it up for everyone to see. The dandy in his suit, forever dapper, forever Mexican. And immediately before anyone could place their bean, would come the commentary. El Catron reminds me of Lupita's new boyfriend, Tia Gloria would say, and the other TIAs would laugh because they all knew Lupita's boyfriend, knew he dressed too well for someone who supposedly worked construction, knew there were questions nobody was asking out loud but everyone was thinking. That one's too pretty, Tia Carmen would add. A man shouldn't be prettier than his woman, and Lupita, if she was there, would roll her eyes and place her bean and say, yajis, but she'd be smiling because this was how love was shown in the barrio, through teasing, through concern disguised as gossip, through the collective surveillance of a community that cared enough to pay attention. La Sirena. The mermaid would appear, and someone would have her, would place their bean with satisfaction, and Tia Rosa would already be moving to the next card but the conversation would continue, would layer over the game like music over a bass line. Speaking of Serenas, did you see what Veronica's daughter was wearing to school? This from Tia Sylvia, her voice dropping to that particular register that meant scandal was coming, that meant the information was both too good not to share and too improper to say loudly. The TIAs would lean in. The children would pretend not to listen while listening harder. This was the architecture of these evenings, the game providing structure, the gossip providing substance, the two intertwining until you couldn't separate them, until the point wasn't really winning Lotería but being part of this circle, this conversation, this web of information and opinion and care. El Corazon, the heart, pierced and bleeding, romantic and ridiculous at once. More beans would hit tablas and the conversation would shift to someone's sister whose husband was seen talking to his ex-wife, and wasn't that suspicious and shouldn't someone say something, but who would say something and maybe it was innocent, but when was it ever innocent and remember when? The stories would flow like water finding its path, each Tia contributing, each one adding details, each one interpreting events through their own lens of experience and prejudice and love. They'd talk about pregnancies and proposals, about job losses and job offers, about someone's son who was doing so well in college and someone else's son who dropped out, and was that any surprise given the family he came from, though we shouldn't judge, though of course we're judging, though judgment was just caring by another name, wasn't it? The children absorbed it all. They learned their family history through these sessions, learned who was related to whom and how, learned the old country stories and the immigration stories and the stories of struggle and survival that shaped who they were even if they didn't understand that yet. They learned who to trust and who to avoid, which relatives were reliable and which made promises they wouldn't keep, which neighbors would help in a crisis and which would pretend they weren't home. La Muerte. The skeleton in her elegant dress, death rendered friendly, death made into something you could laugh at, death as just another character in the deck. The TIAs would cross themselves, would make jokes about getting old, about their backs and their knees and their eyesight, would compete over who had more ailments, whose doctor was worse, whose pharmacy bills were higher. I'm telling you, Tia Elena would say, one of these days I'm going to wake up and just be a pile of bones. Puro huso. Nothing left. At least you'd be skinny finally, Tia Beatriz would shoot back and everyone would laugh because this too was love, this roasting, this familiarity that allowed insults because everyone knew they weren't really insults, they were just the rough texture of intimacy, the way family talked when they trusted each other enough to be honest. The game would continue. El Nopal. La Luna. El Venado. La Mano. Each card bringing new beans to tablas, new tangents in conversation, new layers of gossip and storytelling. Somewhere around the 20th card, someone would get close to winning, would need just one or two more images to complete their tabla, and the tension would ratchet up even though the stakes were nothing, even though the prize was usually just bragging rights or maybe getting to call the next game. Lotería. The shout would come, triumphant and sudden, and everyone would groan or congratulate depending on who won. If it was one of the children, the TIAs would make a big deal of it, would verify the tabla dramatically, would declare it official and fair even though they'd barely glanced at it because the point was making the child feel important, feel successful, feel like they'd accomplished something. If it was one of the TIAs, there'd be accusations of cheating, playful but with an edge of seriousness because some of them did cheat, would place beans on images that hadn't been called, would claim Lotería before they actually had it, would do whatever it took to win because competition was in their blood, because losing was for people who didn't care, because caring meant trying to win even if it was just a game. The tabla would be cleared. Beans would be collected and redistributed. Someone would shuffle the deck for the next round. And the conversation would never stop, would just shift, would move from topic to topic like a river finding new channels while remaining fundamentally the same river. They'd talk about church, who'd been there, who hadn't, what Father Miguel had said in his homily though nobody really listened to his homilies because he spoke too softly and his Spanish had an accent from somewhere other than Mexico and it was hard to respect spiritual guidance from someone who couldn't properly roll his R's. They'd talk about work, who'd gotten hired, who'd gotten fired, which houses in Beverly Hills were treating their housekeepers well and which were demanding too much for too little money, which construction foremen were fair and which were cabrons who'd work you 12 hours and pay you for 8. They'd talk about immigration, carefully because you never knew who was documented and who wasn't, because that information was private and dangerous, because the wrong word in the wrong ear could end with La Migra at someone's door at 5 a.m., could end with families separated, could end with everything falling apart. So they talked around it, talked in code, said things like, you know how it is, and these times are difficult, and understood each other perfectly without saying anything directly. They'd talk about the old country, Mexico, which was simultaneously the place they'd left and the place they'd never left, the place they missed desperately and the place they'd never go back to permanently, the place that lived in their hearts in a version that didn't quite match reality anymore but was more real than reality because it was memory, because it was longing, because it was the story they told themselves about who they were and where they came from. In Mexico, someone would start and everyone would lean in because these stories were treasures, were the oral history that kept culture alive, that transmitted values and traditions to children who'd never seen the places being described but who'd carry those images anyway, who'd dream in Spanish about towns they'd never visited, who'd feel homesick for homes they'd never lived in. The second game would start. Then the third. Time would pass in that strange summer night way where it felt simultaneously endless and fleeting, where it seemed like you'd just started but also like you'd been there for hours, where the present moment stretched and contracted like something alive, something precious. The children would get drowsy. The youngest ones would fall asleep on laps or on blankets spread on the porch floor, their tablas still clutched in their hands, their dreams probably filled with Serenas and Catrins and Lunas. The older kids would fight sleep, would insist they weren't tired, would accept one more game and then one more until their eyes were closing between calls, until they were placing beans by muscle memory more than attention. The snacks would be consumed. The containers would be emptied and packed away. Someone would make a coffee run, not to Starbucks, never to Starbucks, but to someone's kitchen where there was always a pot of coffee on the stove, where it was made Mexican style with cinnamon and piloncillo, where it was strong enough to keep you up until dawn if you weren't careful. Around midnight the game would start to wind down. Not because anyone wanted it to end, but because tomorrow was Sunday and there was church, or tomorrow was Monday and there was work, or tomorrow was just tomorrow and it was coming whether they were ready or not. The children would be carried home half asleep, Lotería tablas tucked under arms, beans spilling from pockets. The TIAs would fold up tables and chairs, would make plans to do it again next week or maybe the week after, would hug and kiss cheeks and say, "Que descanses," even though they'd probably see each other tomorrow at the grocery store or at church or just walking down the street. Tia Rosa would be the last one on the porch, gathering the cards and counting them, all 54 still there. Nobody had walked off with La Muerte or El Borracho, nobody had accidentally pocketed El Sol. She'd put them back in their box, would wrap the rubber band around them that kept them together, would place the box on the shelf where it lived between games, where it waited patiently for the next summer night, the next gathering, the next opportunity to be the excuse for connection. The porch light would click off. The street would return to its regular night personality, quiet but not silent, sleeping but not dead, just resting, just gathering strength for tomorrow, for the next day, for the next summer night when the heat would break and the moths would gather and someone would say, "Lotería at Rosa's tonight," and the whole beautiful cycle would begin again. Years later those children would grow up and move away. They'd live in places where neighbors didn't know each other's names, where summer nights were spent indoors with air conditioning, where games came from screens instead of boxes, where gossip happened through text instead of across card tables. And they'd feel the loss of it even if they couldn't quite articulate what they'd lost. They'd try to explain it to their own children. "We used to play this game," they'd say, maybe pulling up images on the internet, maybe buying a cheap Loteria set from a gift shop that sold Mexican kitsch. "We'd sit outside and my tias would talk and we'd play until late. But it wouldn't be the same. Couldn't be the same. Because it wasn't really about the game. It was about the porch lights and the beans and the moths and the gossip and the coffee and the way your tia would tell you to pay attention, mija, you just missed La Escalera, and the way winning felt important even though it wasn't, and the way being included felt like love even when they were gossiping about your family, about your choices, about your life. It was about summer nights when the barrio belonged to everyone who was willing to sit outside and be part of it, when community wasn't something you joined but something you were born into, something you couldn't escape even if you wanted to, something that held you even when it drove you crazy, especially when it drove you crazy. Those nights were workshops in being human, in being family, in being Mexican-American in a way that honored both parts of that hyphen. They were education in social dynamics and family politics, in the delicate balance of loyalty and honesty, in the art of saying difficult things with love, in the skill of listening not just to what was said but to what was meant. The Loteria cards were just cards. Images printed on cardboard. But they were also mirrors reflecting a culture, symbols carrying generations of meaning, totems of an identity that persisted despite everything, despite borders and language barriers and assimilation pressure and the passage of time. La Dama taught you about dignity. El Borracho taught you about excess and its consequences. La Muerte taught you not to fear the inevitable. El Corazón taught you that love was worth the risk of pain. La Luna taught you that beauty existed even in darkness. El Nopal taught you that what appeared hostile could also sustain you, could be the source of life, could be home. And the act of playing, of gathering, of sitting in circles lit by porch lights, of listening to your TIA's gossip while claiming you weren't paying attention, of learning your family secrets while pretending to focus on your tabla, of marking beans and calling Loteria and being part of something larger than yourself, that taught you everything else. It taught you that family was complicated and beautiful and frustrating and essential. That community required participation, required showing up, required being willing to sit on uncomfortable chairs and eat food you didn't ask for and listen to stories you'd heard before. That tradition wasn't something static preserved in museums but something living and breathing and changing and adapting, something that happened every time people chose to gather, chose to play, chose to be together even when it would be easier to stay inside, stay separate, stay alone. The barrio would change. Was always changing. Families would move away, would be pushed out by rising rents or pulled away by better opportunities or scattered by the simple entropy of modern life. The porches would stay but the people would rotate, new families bringing new traditions or no traditions, understanding the old ways or not understanding, caring or not caring. But for a while, for a precious, golden while, there were summer nights and porch lights and Lotería cards and TIAs who gossiped and children who listened and beans that marked progress toward victory and connection and belonging. For a while the game was enough. The gathering was enough. The simple act of being together under a bare bulb surrounded by moths and mosquitoes and family was enough. And on the best nights, the nights that lived on in memory with the clarity of dreams and the weight of truth, someone would place their last bean and shout, Lotería, and everyone would cheer or groan and then someone would say, otra vez, and they'd shuffle the cards and redistribute the beans and start again, always starting again, always choosing to gather, always choosing family, always choosing each other. Because that's what you did. That's what the game taught you. That's what the summer nights and the porch lights and the TIA's gossip all added up to, the simple, profound truth that you kept showing up, kept playing, kept being part of the circle, kept choosing connection over isolation, kept choosing otra vez, kept choosing yes to another game, another night, another chance to be together, to be family, to be home.